Good Monday, everybody. Welcome to Charting with Dan. I am Dan, and I'm happy to be back here. I was off last week. I was out of the office, but I'm back today. We're going to talk about Toy Story 4, its performance over the weekend. A disappointment? We'll talk about that because I have some very strong thoughts on that. We're also going to loop back on a couple of things that I missed last week with Men in Black International, with the second week of Dark Phoenix. So much to talk about. It's just me today because I'm going to be honest. I did a little bit of a deep dive, and rather than subject Lon or Roth or someone in the office to my ramblings about it, I'm just going to subject you to them, if that's all right. So we're going to talk first and foremost about Toy Story 4, the number one movie of the weekend. Once final numbers came in this afternoon, the final number was over $120 million. The number one movie as expected. Everybody knew that Toy Story was going to open at the top of the box office as we look at the chart. But the question isn't so much that it opened, but how big it opened. Because there's been a lot of news and a lot of perception going around. A lot of people saying that even though it's a number one opening, even though it's a $120 million opening, it seems like it's a little bit of a disappointment. And that's what I keep seeing in a lot of the coverage is, well, it opened well, but it's a disappointment. It opened below expectations. It's not a great opening. And I wanted to dig down into that because, to be honest, sometimes you look at that $120 million. It's hard to look at Toy Story 4 opening at that number and it being a disappointing opening. And a lot of it has to do with something that we've talked about on the show so many times, and that is tracking. And apologies if you've heard this before. We've talked about it in a few other different contexts, but it's very important to what I want to delve into with Toy Story 4 first. And we're going to get to all the other movies after. But I wanted to really dig into this because it has driven so much of the narrative about the performance of the movie this weekend. So let's talk about tracking. And if you need just a quick refresher on tracking, is very briefly, tracking is numbers that are generated by different firms, different companies in Hollywood. Originally, what they were used for, they were internal numbers. The studios would hire companies to do this research, to study their marketing. Is their advertising working? What does it look like their movies are going to open at? Is it going to open to $100 million? Do you think our advertising is working? They would hire these firms to track a movie before it opened, report back to them what they thought the opening number would be based on what they're seeing, different kinds of metrics. But as entertainment media grew, as people were looking for more and more to write about with the box office, those numbers started filtering their way through to the trade publications, your Varieties, your Hollywood Reporters, your Deadlines, and then the tracking numbers, which are essentially reporting on how a movie is going to do before it opens, then became a big part of the news cycle. You've probably seen a story, if you watch this show, you've probably seen a story about a movie based on tracking, what tracking estimates a movie is going to do. Sometimes it's low. You get a movie like a Black Panther or a Wonder Woman that opens higher than what tracking says it's going to. But sometimes, and we've seen this a lot this summer, you get a movie that opens under what the tracking is. It's a very variable kind of thing, and it's not an exact science. We've covered that on the show before, but I wanted to specifically dive into Toy Story 4 and its history with tracking, and how was the expectation for this movie set as high as it was going into the weekend, and why the $120 million opening in many circles would be considered a disappointment. So to start, I went back to, as far back as I could find, the first tracking numbers that were provided for Toy Story 4. And what I found was some tracking numbers that came from Box Office Pro. Now, Box Office is an organization that has followed numbers in box office for a long time. They have associations with NATO, which is the National Association of Theater Owners, back in late April, and they do long-range tracking for a lot of films. They set their long-range tracking for Toy Story 4. As you can see there, the opening weekend range they gave was $105 million to $130 million. And this is 2 months before the movie opens. A lot of times you'll see these wide ranges because, again, nobody knows. No one's seen it. Maybe some trailers have come out. By that time, there had been a trailer or two for Toy Story 4. But nobody knows exactly what the variables are going to be. But as you can see, that tracking number, 105 to 130, Toy Story 4 actually performed in the upper range of that initial number. Now, that is tracking, though, that they did. When it started hitting the trades, your Varieties, your Deadlines, your Hollywood Reporters, that's when that window started to expand. This is a number from a month later, as you can see, May 30th, so a shade under a month before the movie opened. This is a article from Variety. As you can see, Toy Story 4 eyes a huge $100 to $150 million opening weekend. Now, this was apparently the day that the tracking numbers, the firms or whomever, the numbers got to the trades and they started generating their stories. Now, the thing that's difficult as you're going back through this coverage on the tracking is it always says analysts predict, analysts say, tracking suggests, tracking indicates. But probably because of the relationship between the publications, the studios, and the firms that do this tracking, there's never a hard resource to go back and say, this firm said that, these analysts said that. It will just say tracking indicates or a movie is expected to. It's very vague, so it's tough to track down where all of the numbers came from. And that's where I think you really need to look at the windows and what the expectation for a movie is based on tracking. Because as you can see on May 30th, in that story, Toy Story 4 was projected for a $100 to $150 million opening. The same day, there you go, May 30th, 2019, 9 a.m. Pacific time. This is a story from Deadline on the same day, May 30th, 2019, from less than an hour and a half earlier, citing tracking numbers, again, not specific ones, just that they'd seen the tracking numbers. That Deadline story estimated that Toy Story 4 could open, if we want to look at it one more time, could open to a potential $200 million, that pre-sales were strong, that it could, it's looking to unseat Incredibles 2 to set the opening weekend animation record at $200 million. So on the same day, within 90 minutes of each other, based on tracking numbers, you have various outlets reporting that Toy Story 4 is going to open anywhere from $100 to $200 million. That's a pretty big window. But what happens when those windows are established is it sets the tone of the conversation, which is when you looked at last Friday before the movie opened, you saw a lot of articles like this. This is one from Forbes talking about what Toy Story 4 needs to have the best animated opening weekend ever, based on the tracking, based on obviously the strong reviews. There was an expectation that it could even exceed that. Now, Disney made their expectation was $140 million. And yes, Toy Story 4 did come in below that number by about $20 million. So by that metric, it came in below Disney's reported expectation. But that's still way below $200 million. And it's still way below what a lot of other people, a lot of articles cited as their expectations based on tracking, but we don't know what those numbers said. And as we saw, the windows based on those numbers, as initially reported, were vast, between $100 to $200 million. Now, something else happened as well. And I think what happened with Toy Story is it got caught up in another thing that's happening in Hollywood, another part of the news cycle, which is that there have been several movies this summer, Dark Phoenix, Men in Black International, Godzilla King of the Monsters even, that have come in and either performed terribly or underperformed based on not just expectation based on tracking, but underperformed based on budget, based on the fact that they're sequels that are looking to build towards something, in the case of Godzilla, where you have this concept that the summer after Avengers, with exceptions like Aladdin and John Wick 3, has been kind of lackluster, even with Secret Life of Pets, which opened to less than half of the original film. And that's why Toy Story 4 was also being discussed, and this is from another Deadline story, going into last weekend, as a savior, as the movie that's going to swoop in and save the summer box office. And so I think when it didn't do that, when it didn't open to $200 million, as some people had expected based on numbers that we're not really sure where they came from, this is the tone of the coverage that we saw. I've seen a lot of articles that look like this. Here's why it's disappointing opening, opens big but below expectations, tops box office but falls short of studios' hopes. Some of those come right out and say that the movie just was disappointing. Others have said that they'll acknowledge that it did well, but it came short of expectations. That's the expectation game that was established by these numbers. But I think the problem with setting the expectation based on those numbers is maybe those numbers aren't exactly meant to do what people think that they're meant to do. And I'll tell you why I believe that. This has actually happened before. Back in 2010, after a somewhat strong start to the summer, including Iron Man 2 opening in early May, going into June, there were several high-profile, big-budget bombs. Robin Hood, Sex and the City 2, Prince of Persia, The A-Team, and in June of that year, a Pixar movie swooped in that was expected to completely revitalize the summer box office. And that movie was Toy Story 3. And there were people at that time who, when the movie opened, had much the same reaction to Toy Story 3 that they're having today to Toy Story 4. This is an article from Richard Corliss, June 20th, 2000. Toy Story 3 box office, great, but not that great. And what that article goes on to say is that while the opening of Toy Story 3 was strong, it didn't really come in and swoop and save the day as a summer savior like perhaps they had expected. And there were other analysts who backed that up. The Toy Story 3 opened well, but it was not the box office savior that had been expected. Now, Toy Story 3 went on to gross over $400 million domestically. It was the #1 film of that summer. It went on to gross over $1 billion worldwide, but it opened under similar circumstances where it was expected to do incredibly well, so that when it opened really well, it was regarded as a bit of a disappointment. And in the summer of 2010, there were a lot of films that were tracked to either open big and open small, or that had tracking that suggested that they weren't going to open great, movies like the Karate Kid remake, that ended up excelling and doing better than the tracking suggested. It was so prevalent that summer that The Wrap actually ran an article based on the tracking, which had some information that I think is very relevant to the conversations that we're having today. This is from that article back in the summer of 2010. This is called Box Office Blindsides from The Wrap. Talk to Talk executives at one of the major tracking services, OTX, MarketCast, and National Research Group, and they're likely to tell you that predicting a film's opening gross at the domestic box office is really a parlor trick and not what their core service is all about. The real use of tracking is to measure the effectiveness of the marketing weeks out from release so that you can make adjustments while there's still time, said Vinny Bruzes, president of the Worldwide Motion Picture Group for OTX. By the time the official prediction comes out on the day of the release, it's fairly useless. The purpose of the tracking is to provide a snapshot of the marketplace and how studio marketing materials are being received, added an official for another tracking firm who declined to be named. The purpose is not to project what the market is going to be. And I think that we have to keep that in mind as we're looking at the coverage around films, as we're looking at how movies are released, how they're covered, which is that the box office tracking for Toy Story 4 drove so much of the coverage. And so many people expected it to perform so incredibly well that when it just came in and did really well, it wasn't regarded as a huge success. And I think that the tracking is not a fair way to judge that, because as you can see from those quotes and as we've seen elsewhere, the tracking is not necessarily supposed to be an accurate assessment of what a movie is going to do the day it opens. It's supposed to be a tool for studios to see how well their marketing is working. It's a pre-release tool. You can't track enthusiasm. I've said that on the show before, positive or negative. You can make your best guess, but I really think that when you're looking at Toy Story 4, you don't just look at what it was expected to do. Yes, it came in a little bit underneath what Disney wanted, but I think you also have to, or not even wanted necessarily. The coverage, and I found, was just that it just said that Disney had said it expected a $140 million opening. I looked for the direct quote from Disney. I didn't find a direct quote. It was reported in several other stories that Disney was expecting a $140 million opening, but even still, you can't just look at that number and call a movie a disappointment based only on that, because let's look at the actual numbers. Toy Story 4 cost $200 million to make. It grossed $120 million domestically, and we'll look at the worldwide market. It was the highest animated grossing opening weekend of all time worldwide. It was not a disappointment. Now, there are other films in the $200 million range that I think you can make that argument for. As I mentioned before, Godzilla King of the Monsters cost reportedly the same amount of money, $200 million, made less worldwide in more worldwide markets on its opening weekend, made far less domestically. I think you could make an argument that that would be a disappointing opening, because it is a movie that's building toward a conclusion. It is a sequel that was bigger than the original. Its numbers were far below some of the preceding films in the same franchise, whereas Toy Story 4, even if you adjust for inflation, Toy Story 3 only opened about $10 million, I think, higher than Toy Story 4. And I think if you ask any executive, if you can go from a third movie in a franchise to a fourth movie in a franchise, a fourth movie that a lot of people may have been a little skeptical about, and only drop off maybe $10 million, they take that deal. They take $120 million opening. They take $230 million worldwide. You can't just look at what tracking says about a movie and judge that movie to be a disappointment because it failed to meet expectations when there are other things like budget and worldwide gross potential. What animated films usually have much longer legs than live action films. Family films have much longer legs than live action films. Now, if Toy Story 4 next week drops 65% like Men in Black International did, then we can sit here and talk about, oh, okay, now let's see what happened. But if Toy Story 4 holds like it does, like Pixar movies generally do, if it can play for the next 3 or 4 weeks, if it has legs and can continue to rack up grosses and makes $250, $300, $350, $400 million as Toy Story 3 did, then what is the fact that the opening was slightly less maybe than expected? What does that really mean? The opening weekend is part of the picture, but it's not the entire picture. And you can't write off one movie as a disappointment based just on one set of numbers that may not even be made to predict what a movie is going to make. So Toy Story 4, in my books, is a really strong opening in a summer that needed strong openings. And we'll see what it does next week, and the week after that, we'll see where it stands at the end of the summer. But a disappointment, maybe the summer of 2019 is a disappointment, but that's not what I'm ready to call Toy Story 4. All right, let's look at the rest of the top 5 now that we're 40 minutes into the show. As I mentioned, Child's Play, the number 2 film of the weekend. Aladdin, number 3. Aladdin for me still, and I've said this on other episodes of the show, maybe the biggest surprise of the summer. Aladdin is now in its 5th week in the top 3. The last summer movie to spend 5 weeks in the top 3 was Suicide Squad back in 2016. Now, it was a little bit of a different time in the summer, though. Suicide Squad opened late in the summer. It really played out through August, which is a slower summer release schedule. If you want to go back to the last summer film to open in May and spend 5 weeks in the top 3, that's The Avengers back in 2012, which is pretty impressive for Aladdin to be the first film since The Avengers to open that early in the summer and stay in the top 3 for that long. Aladdin is really playing strongly, not just domestically, but worldwide, and we'll look at that gross in a little bit. Aladdin, I think, because it's not number 1 every week, I think it just kind of cruises along at number 2 worldwide and number 3 domestically, or number 2 domestically. I think that Aladdin is really doing something pretty remarkable, and I think it's also a testament to the fact that a lot of the competition that's coming out isn't really that strong, and people are just choosing to go back and see the movie that they saw and that they liked already, to go back and see that a second time maybe, then go see some of these other movies the first time. Disney is also having what you could call a year. They're having a year. I mentioned looking at what Toy Story 4 did this past weekend. On the domestic side, it was one of the top 5 highest animated domestic premiere weekends for a movie, opening weekends for a movie. We had JT, if you can throw that's number 10. There you go. Thank you. Number 4, this is the 4th highest opening weekend domestically for a film, just behind Shrek the Third, just ahead of Minions, Incredibles 2 and Finding Dory. A lot of people were projecting what Toy Story 4 was going to do based on Incredibles 2 and Finding Dory. I do think that those movies did well because they were also the first follow-ups to films that didn't have sequels, and there were long layoffs between the first film and the second film, whereas this is the 4th Toy Story movie, even though it's been 9 years since the last one. I still think, again, most executives, if they were going to open an animated film to be in the top 4 domestically, they'd be pretty happy with. But worldwide, Toy Story 4 actually takes the crown, the biggest animated film worldwide for an opening weekend of all time. It tops Incredibles 2's record from last year. Number 3, I like that number 3 and number 5 were not ones I would have anticipated. Ice Age, Dawn of the Dinosaurs, The Simpsons movie. I believe Disney now owns all of those IP. So, as I said, they're having a bit of a year. And then as far as opening weekends, 4 of the top 5, Well, guess who they belong to? They belong to Disney. Disney now has the number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 highest grossing opening weekends domestically of the year. As a matter of fact, those same 4 films, Avengers Endgame, Captain Marvel, Toy Story 4, and Aladdin, are also the 4 highest worldwide opening weekends of the year. It's a little scary, if I'm being honest. It's a little scary how well Disney's doing, but they came to play. They've got the IP, and in a summer littered with disappointments and studios that are wondering what the future of their franchises are, Disney's doing all right. Now, one person that did have a franchise film that came out last week that I wasn't here to cover, that I did want to come back around on real quick, was Chris Hemsworth of Men in Black International. Did not have a great opening, fell 65%, as I mentioned, domestically this week. Number 4 went from number 1 to number 4 at the box office. Chris Hemsworth is, I think, a really funny actor, and this is not to say that he does not have a lot of fans, because he does, but I think that he's in a position that we, before the Fast and the Furious movies, and maybe even still a little bit, kind of found Dwayne Johnson in, which is that he's searching for that thing outside of an expanded universe to call his own. Obviously, he's got Thor, he's got the MCU, he's doing fine. But when you look outside the MCU for films that he's starred in, it's a little bit more of a spotty record. We have the Snow White and the Huntsman, obviously. That was a film that he took on. Snow White, Winter's War, The Huntsman's Winter's War. Not a huge hit. You have Ghostbusters 2016. He had a supporting role in that film. Men in Black International at number 3. These are domestic openings. And then 12 Strong, a movie that came out last year. He's still looking for that signature franchise. And I think maybe he and obviously Sony would have hoped that Men in Black International would be that franchise. It doesn't look like it's going to be that way. But I think that Chris Hemsworth, obviously Thor, a huge part of his career. And certainly if he wants to keep doing that, I think audiences are going to keep showing up for that. But outside of the MCU, I do think that Chris Hemsworth, and he's been in some great movies like Rush that just haven't done great box office that I think are worth seeing. But he's an actor, I think, that once you look outside Thor, maybe still trying to find where exactly he fits in across the different franchises. For a while, it sounded like he was going to go back to Star Trek. He cameoed in Star Trek 09. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. I'm a Hemsworth fan. I hope he finds that role, that franchise. If he wants to supplement that with Thor, or if he wants to branch out and do other stuff, I think that's great too. The other thing that I mentioned or wasn't able to mention last week was Dark Phoenix. When I last left you, Dark Phoenix had not done well. Its week 2 drop was pretty remarkable. In a bad way. We always talk about the fact that 40 to 50% if you're a huge blockbuster is right around where you want to go. 50 to 60% is okay. Not bad, pretty standard. But as if you get over 60%, you really start worrying a little bit. Dark Phoenix hit the red line number. Dark Phoenix dropped over 70% in its second weekend. Not this past weekend, but the weekend before. I felt like I did want to loop back and just show you kind of historically this year in 2019 where that falls. So Dark Phoenix had the 3rd biggest drop in its second week among films that were released on 1,000 or more screens of 2019 so far. The Keanu Sans started after Replicas, because Replicas had the biggest week 2 drop of any film on 1,000 or more screens this year, 81.5%. Harmony Korine's The Beach Bum, but there's Dark Phoenix right in the middle, then The Curse of La Llorona, and Captive State, a movie that I forgot had come out this year, and honestly had forgotten that was around. Rupert Wyatt directed it. I just didn't remember it. Didn't remember that it existed. Dark Phoenix, there was no real good news for Dark Phoenix after its opening weekend, and the news got even worse in week 2. But to see a film like that take a 71+% drop is pretty remarkable. I did want to loop back on that. It should also be noted that Dark Phoenix's budget was about 3 times the budget of those other 4 films on that list combined. So there was really no saving Dark Phoenix after its opening weekend, but week 2 really put the nail in the coffin with that 71% drop. Let's look at this past weekend, wrap that up real quick. Top per theater was Toy Story 4. It took in just over 26K at 4,500 theaters, over 4,500 theaters. The second movie per theater it was literally in one theater in New York. It was a re-release of a documentary about the artist David Hockney called A Bigger Splash. That took in 18K. So this was a case where the movie that took #1 in so many theaters, plus the absence of a real contender and limited release, it takes the per theater crown. Let's widen out. Let's go worldwide. I mentioned the fact that Toy Story 4 had the largest worldwide debut weekend for an animated film, $240 million once the final numbers were in. And there you go. Look at Aladdin, still #2. Still #2, $46 million. It's made some jumps on the worldwide chart since a couple weeks ago when we were here. Men in Black International down to 3 at 40.9 million. Spirited Away. Now that is Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away, the original film, at #4 there. It was released this past weekend in China officially for the first time ever. Had never been released in China before. My Neighbor Totoro was released in China last year, but they are just now releasing those movies, which reportedly had received a lot of acclaim and underground success, despite the fact that it had never been officially released through other channels in China, getting official theatrical releases, all the Studio Ghibli films getting released in China. Not all of them, but certainly it seems like it's going to start becoming more and more. But Spirited Away, officially released in China, finding huge success. As a matter of fact, it destroyed Toy Story 4 in China, which Toy Story 4 opened there this past weekend, obliterated by Spirited Away. So I like those stories. I like tracking those stories. It did really well. Let's look at the 2019 box office, the worldwide box office so far this year. Avengers Endgame, Captain Marvel, but yeah, Aladdin jumping over The Wandering Earth and hanging so tough into the #3 spot. It's now over $800 million worldwide. It has played all through May, the end part of May, and now the complete month of June, and still doing really well. Knocks The Wandering Earth down to 4. How to Train Your Dragon still there at #5. And then we have Godzilla, King of the Monsters entering at #10. However, I think that's going to be short-lived because there are some big contenders, including Spider-Man and The Lion King and others that are probably going to jump in there, maybe knock that one off. Dumbo, Shazam, a couple of those ones down toward the middle are probably going to get knocked out here in the next few weeks, but Godzilla, King of the Monsters does enter that list at #10. Let's look at the 2019 domestic charts. Avengers Endgame, that's going to be there probably for the rest of the year. Secret Life of Pets 2, Toy Story 4 opens at the #9 spot. Shazam gets knocked down a couple. Pokemon, Detective Pikachu, and John Wick Chapter 3 still climbing the charts, knocking Shazam down. And again, that's why you play the game. I would not have guessed that Shazam would lose out to either of those films. Toy Story 4 looking to make a move there. Secret Life of Pets 2, again, as I mentioned with animated films, despite the fact that it didn't have a really remarkable opening, it is kind of hung in there. It's over $115 million now. It's not going to be anywhere near the success that the first film was, but Universal kept the price tag on that cheap, hoping that the worldwide gross would bear that strategy out, and it looks like that's what's happening. The summer movie report, we lost a couple movies. I've been gone a couple weeks. This reflects the change since the last 2 weeks since I've done the show. So this is 2 weeks worth of change. Men in Black International on the list there at #9. Ma still there at #10. Dark Phoenix on the rise for now, but that's not going to be long for the list. Rocketman and Godzilla both taking a bit of a tumble. Toy Story 4 opening as the #4 film of the summer domestically. Secret Life of Pets 2 bumping up to the #5 spot. Again, as we get through July, 1 month from today, that list is going to look very different because there are some big heavy hitters coming. Speaking of heavy hitters, it was about time to stop tracking this race. However, also while I was gone last week, Marvel decided to change up the game and do it's not a re-release because the movie never closed. So you can't re-release something that's still in release. So let's call it an expanded expansion, a re-expansion, Avengers Endgame Plus. I don't know what you would call it, but it's coming this weekend. So we should track the Avengers Avatar Road to the all-time global record. Avengers is getting closer and closer to that number. It's now about $37 million away. It looked like it was going to really crawl close close. I honestly thought that Endgame would not be re-expanded or re-released at all back into theaters until long after the summer. But as Kevin Feige and Marvel announced last week, Avengers Endgame is expanding back into theaters this weekend. The tickets apparently are going on sale in some places tonight, in some places tomorrow. There's no extra material in the film itself. There is apparently deleted material and a tribute after the credits, so no extra material in the film itself, according to Marvel, but extra stuff supplemented after the credits. That is going back into theaters or expanding into more theaters this weekend, so that number may change, or everyone may have decided that they're going to wait for the Blu-ray or to see if they can get this extra material somewhere else. That's one story to track this weekend, to see if Avengers Endgame gets a substantial bump from this re-expansion. It's so close to the record, there may be Endgame fans that just say, I want to get it over the hump, I want to get it over Avatar, and they turn out just to put their dollars towards that record. We'll see what happens. Also opening this week, Annabelle Comes Home, opening a little early. It's not opening on Friday, it's opening on Wednesday. Previews for that start tomorrow night. We were talking to JT about it. It took both of us by surprise. We both forgot that it opened on Wednesday this week. And also opening in theaters this weekend in wide release yesterday, the Beatles-themed film, What If the Beatles Had Never Existed? We're going to find out in theaters this weekend. That's all that I've got, because I'm going to lose my voice if I keep talking. Thank you for doing this solo charting with me. As always, there's no perfect way to analyze the box office, but I do think whatever information you get, source it, see where it comes from, do your research, make your own conclusions. And if you disagree with me, if you think the Toy Story 4 should have opened $50 million higher and you think it was a disappointment, well, that's all right. You can let me know in the comments below. Let me know what you think. There's certainly a lot of other people out there that think it was a disappointment as well. I just happen to disagree with that assessment. Thank you for watching Charting with Dan. Happy to be back with you, and I will see you next week as we see what happened with Avengers Endgame, what happened with Annabelle yesterday, and everything else that's in theaters. Until then, thanks for watching.